Welcome back to another episode of Light Beer, Dark Money. I'm Sean Noble. Chris Clements is out today, but in his stead, we have two awesome guests, one from far, far away and one right next to me. The one right next to me is Andy Bookless. He's our resident Brit.
Yes.
Who,
Hello.
will give us some perspective on what we're going to be talking about with our faraway guest, which is Stephen Moore, coming to us live from Ukraine. And Stephen is a former chief of staff on the Hill. He's now running Ukraine Freedom Project. And Stephen, thank you so much for taking the time late in the evening for you on your way to a long drive to Poland. Thanks for being here.
Yeah, so I'm actually standing in one of Ukraine's finer gas stations, the Log, which is, as I mentioned to you guys earlier, the hot dog technology they have perfected here in Ukraine is just amazing. The bread is not like two pieces of bread. It is a round piece of bread that they just stick the hot dog into, and it's like encased in bread. It's amazing.
That's great.
It's sustenance for your long drive ahead, right?
Yes. Well, and Stephen, so this is obviously very, very timely. The Senate has passed the Ukraine aid package. The House has said it's dead on arrival. There's a lot of discussion about what's going to happen. You were in D.C. Recently, met with over 100 members. I am mystified as to where we are on this. Give us a little perspective from what you see on the ground in Ukraine and why you're there.
Yeah, so the disconnect between what I've seen in my 2 years here in Ukraine, I've been to the front a dozen times. I'm probably one of the few people that has actually been to the Ukrainian front and been to the floor of the House of Representatives. So, the disconnect between what Americans, particularly conservatives, believe and what is actually happening here is vast. So, just a couple of things like there's people that say, "Oh, Ukraine can't win," but Ukraine has taken the $42 billion in weapons that we've given them so far, and they have driven the Russians back 800 miles. It's easy to forget that in March of 2022, Kyiv was surrounded on three sides,
right.
and so the Russians are now in control of only 17% of Ukraine's land. And most of Ukraine, as a testament to the effectiveness of U.S. aid money, is highly functioning. 83% of Ukraine is highly functioning. The 17% that is controlled by Russians, the worst things imaginable are happening. And we're talking 93,000 incidences of rape. We're talking Christians, pastors, systematically being tortured and murdered for their faith. We're talking about 19,000 children being kidnapped. And these are just the children that the Ukrainian government has a name for, has identified. There's probably tens of thousands more. So, so people in America don't understand this. Yeah.
Well, it is. I mean, literally people in America, I don't think they quite understand, there's all this talk about, well, why are we more worried about the Ukrainian border and not our border? As if we can't chew and walk at the same time. Right. I mean, walk and chew gum at the same time.
I think you blew that line.
Yeah, I did.
You can't even say walk and chew gum at the same time.
Exactly.
But most Americans can do it. So we should be in good
I'm
shape.
the exception. But it is so frustrating to me because, I mean, here we have in Putin a bloodthirsty monster. And I'm just going to say that outright because the guy is former KGB. Anyone who watched the Tucker interview and didn't say, well, that guy is lying through his teeth is being completely duped. And I think Tucker has been duped, frankly. This guy's as bad, if not worse, than Hitler in the sense of he has no qualms about what they want, and that is a complete world domination.
Well, he's not exactly hiding his ambition.
Right.
What was it, Steve, you were telling us earlier about his campaign slogan for re-election?
Yeah. Oh, so he tells Tucker, "Oh, Tucker, I just want peace." But his campaign slogan, and you can Google this, is "Russia's border knows no bounds."
Yeah, it's unbelievable.
And that's getting him elected.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and I think what's fascinating to me is that for decades it was the right side of the aisle that was the anti-Soviet, anti-Russia position. It was the left. It was Bernie Sanders and Ted Kennedy who were going to Russia, who were talking about how great Russia is, and they just we need to broker peace and we need to have arms disarmament, that kind of thing. And now the script is completely flipped. Yep. You have people on the right, populists on the right that are saying, "Oh no, Russia's not. Putin's a strong leader. He's great." Yep. It is just fundamentally astounding to me. And the parallels to World War II, I think, are just crazy. To me, it just seems so like history repeating itself completely.
Absolutely. And I'll let Steve weigh in here, but the one point I remember just recently, Mitch McConnell, I think, was on the record saying that, having passed his legislation in the Senate, he 6 months ago felt very confident that the majority of Republican senators were with him. And now he's recognized that the MAGA isolationist view is in the ascendancy, and he was just happy to get that legislation passed.
Yeah, I mean, he got only had 20 senators. Stephen, you were in D.C. You talked to a number of members. There's, we clearly have seen a shift in the support of Ukraine going backwards in the United States. What do you think that is about?
Largely it is 23 months of unanswered Russian propaganda. And I can give you some examples. Like my mother is an 89-year-old conservative Christian, and she's just a wonderful woman. She's my mother. She's beautiful. And but she sends me stuff. She sent me like something she got in the email of Zelensky with a pile of cocaine on his desk, which was, you and I look at it and we're like, oh, okay, that's Photoshop. Right. But many of the folks that receive that don't know that. My mom asked me. And there's also something that came out of Russia where it says Zelensky has bought 2 yachts with US taxpayer money, and all you got to do is do a little bit of Googling, and both those yachts are still up for sale. Nobody's bought them. And so, but again, this stuff gets out. It gets out of the ecosphere. And then you have more sophisticated actors like Tucker Carlson. Tucker Carlson has just outright said, why aren't we supporting Russia? I am. And, so it's a little bit hard to take him seriously as a journalist if it was ever not hard to take him seriously as a journalist.
Right.
So again, you got all these people that are just repeating the Russian narrative. And and the truth of the matter is that the $42 billion in weapons we sent over here, for that amount of money, the Ukrainians have taken down Vladimir Putin's war fighting capability by half.
Right.
So he has lost like 5,000 tanks. He's lost like 350,000 troops. And I want you to think about it. You guys are both policy geeks. You'll get this. So since 2000, I looked this up, since the year 2000, when Putin came to power, the U.S. Department of Defense, the Pentagon, has spent $14 trillion. Okay. So that has been how much they spent since 2000. Part of that is to deter Russia. How much? I don't know. They don't break it down that way. Right. Let's say 20% of it was to deter Russia. That's $2.8 trillion. And it didn't work because Putin went into Ukraine twice, Georgia, Syria. He was causing all kinds of chaos in the world. What people also forget about is the Havana syndrome, which has crippled, like several hundred of our intelligence agents, right. Of our CIA officers and other people in the clandestine service. So that $2.8 trillion didn't work. What has worked is the $42 billion, a tiny fraction of that we sent to Ukraine.
Yeah, that's a great point. Well, and it is, and the amount of money we're talking about going to the Ukraine, it sounds like a ton. $60 billion in this latest package. Yeah, it's a lot of money, but it is a fraction compared to the overall budget, and for what it will do to protect our future, the nation's future, and the world's future against tyranny. Stephen, how do you? So there are some people say, well, the two big complaints I see is there's no control on the money. There's a lot of waste. There's a lot of corruption, and secondly, they haven't told us what the plan is. That is something that people talk about all the time. I don't know exactly what they mean by that, other than we have to beat Russia. I think that's the plan. And I don't know that the American people, I mean, I don't know that they would understand what war planning is or what military strategy is. And maybe I'm being naive. I don't know. But how would you answer those critics who say, well, there's too much corruption in the money that we're sending over, where it's being wasted or being stolen, or, there is no real plan?
Yeah, that's a good question. On the corruption, I'm not going to tell you now there's not corruption in Ukraine, but I will tell you this, that it is impossible to get a weapon out of this country. It's surrounded either by Russia or Russian allies like Belarus or NATO countries. And so, which of those borders are you going to tow an M777 howitzer through? And, I'm on my way to the border, and I may spend hours there. I've spent 7.5 hours at the border. I've never seen, a Stryker fighting vehicle come behind me, and go through the border to Poland. Right. So the idea that weapons are being stolen is absurd. And then there's, what I'm told by Ukrainians who know a lot about their government's corruption is that, that Ukrainians steal from themselves. And if you look at this most recent $40 million corruption issue for which they were caught and are going to jail, this was actually Ukrainian taxpayer money that was used, and so that's relatively easy to access. But the donor money actually has all kinds of controls, like Deloitte is monitoring it, like KPMG is monitoring it, and there's like a staff of 165 people from USAID, the Pentagon, and the U.S. Department of State who are all monitoring this, And I think you need to contrast this, just for a reality check, with the Pentagon. The Pentagon has not passed an audit in 6 years. Yeah. By some estimates, they don't know where 67% of their stuff is, and I think that's a little inflated. But but yeah, the Pentagon may be the problem.
Right. Well, and. What about the war? What's the plan? A lot of people say, well, why are we sending more money over there? We don't know what the plan is.
Yeah, and that is a good question. I'll tell you what's happened. What I've seen is that in the first year, I'm a Republican. I've been working for Republican office holders and candidates all my life, all my adult life, and so in the first year, 2022, I really can't fault the Biden administration for what they did. They sent a bunch of weapons over here. They sent them quickly, and the Ukrainians took back a bunch of territory. As I mentioned, they are in control of all but 17% of their territory, thanks to American weapons. Now, what had happened in like January of my traveling companions looking at me and saying, "Are we going to leave yet?"
You got a long drive ahead. We won't keep you too long, I promise.
Yeah, thanks. Again, they're in control of all but 17% of their territory. But then Biden started slow walking weapons. And in general, we're not sending them the weapons they need. We're sending them the weapons that are our secondhand weapons. Like, again, the M777 howitzer, right, that was going to be like consigned to the scrapyard. The Bradleys and the Strykers are all being retired. And so, they're great weapons, but they're not necessarily what the Ukrainians need. Now, Biden promised tanks in January of last year. They got here in October of last year. What is the job of the U.S. Department of Defense if not to get weapons to a war zone quickly? F-16s in February of last year were a bad idea. In May, Biden said they were a good idea, and they still are not here. So, so what's the plan? Well, I'm sure the Ukrainians would like to know that too. Like, hey, man, can you get us the weapons we need? Right. So I think that, the Republicans that are complaining about this, oversight, if they look at the Constitution, is a function of Congress. So
Yep.
provide oversight on Biden. Ask him, ask him the tough questions. Don't go whine there's not enough oversight. You're a member of Congress. Provide the oversight.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
That's a great point. That's a great point.
Steve, you'd mentioned to us, and we're sitting here in Phoenix, Arizona. You're out there with your feet on the ground. You've got people who are at the front right now. Could you talk a little bit about, or share some of those stories about the timeliness, the urgency of what's going on right now? Because government takes time to move things, and it doesn't sound like there is a lot of time based on what you're hearing.
Yeah, and so there's a sense of urgency, and and there's guys at the front. There's super brave people, like my friends at the front are software engineers. My trainer at the gym is going to the front. My girlfriend's yoga instructor is at the front. I've worked with lawyers, a marketing executive for Monster energy drinks. These are like normal everyday people.
Right.
And they're super brave, and they're going, and they've taken on the second most powerful military in the world, supposedly, and they beat them up. And the losses on the Ukrainian side are a fraction of the losses on the Russian side. Now, so if you want to talk about a waste of taxpayer dollars, let's stop funding the Ukrainians and let the Russians roll through and take all those gains. And so people at the front tell me that the ratio of artillery right now is like 1 to 10. The Ukrainians shoot 1 for every 10 that the Russians shoot, and that's not sustainable.
Right.
You can't. Yeah. So and again. People think about this, right now there's a couple of 3 million Ukrainians under occupation by the Russians. And, again, the worst things in the world are happening to those people. And, the Russians, there's Elon Musk, who apparently cannot use Google, has said something to the effect of, what kind of monster would want to keep this war going? Look at all these people dying. Well, what kind of monster wants to leave people under Russian control,
Right?
Where they're being daily, where they're raping children, they're raping little girls, they are systematically taking Protestant churches and shutting them down. They have orders to kill Protestant pastors, because here's the funny thing is they view Baptists, they view, Presbyterians as American religions. And so and the Russian Orthodox Church is a working arm of the Kremlin. So the Russian soldiers assume that, these guys must be American agents, like our guys are agents of the Kremlin. And so they torture them and murder them.
Unbelievable.
Yeah. So one of the things that I wanted to mention, Steve, we talk to you who you're in country at the moment and you're seeing stuff firsthand. I was home for Christmas with my family in the UK, and they have Ukrainian refugees in my parents' little village. And just talking to those few people who have been displaced from their country, you realize quite quickly this isn't just the people who are in Ukraine right now or anything else. This is starting to happen all the way across the continent, where their lives are being upended. The kids are being ripped away from families or friends and other things. And so I think one of the challenges that we see as communicators and political operatives is, how do you communicate that message to an American public that doesn't see that firsthand, right? Because they don't go home to Europe and meet Ukrainian refugees. They don't see what you're seeing on the ground in Ukraine. Steve, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, and that, thanks for asking. That's a good question. What I try to do is, I'm a Christian. I grew up in a very religious household. I've come here. I've met many Christians who have been tortured for their faith, and I've got a friend, Victor. Victor is an evangelical pastor from a place called Luhansk, and he was held by the Russians for 25 days. And in one day in particular, he was tortured by the Russians with an electrical taser, while a Russian Orthodox priest looked on. And then the priest tried to cast demons out of him for being an evangelical Christian. So what I try to do is tell these stories of the people that I've met, and because so Victor is an evangelical Christian. He was a pastor, then he became a software engineer, and now he's back at the front. And so these are incredibly brave people who are suffering for their freedom and for their faith.
Yeah, man, it just I really appreciate that you're telling us these things, because it's something that's completely lost in the political debate over the funding that's going on right now.
Right.
And you have House members who, to a person, I think this would be true. Every Republican House member who opposes Ukrainian funding would consider themselves Christian or religious or spiritual in some sense. How in the world can you allow this evil to continue? And look yourself in the mirror. That's, in my mind, it's just that simple.
Yeah, I mean, I did a quick Google search like Steve recommended before starting this, and Zelensky was addressing a joint session of Congress 14 months ago and shared a battle flag with members of Congress. And so you got to imagine that they're sitting there, Steve, thinking, they've met this guy in person and he's on the ground doing his very best. Can't you equip him with some of the material to continue the job? Surely it must be more personal once you've met those people in person.
And think about it this way. Here's what I don't understand. And I think, Sean, you mentioned this earlier. The amount of money compared to the $6.15 trillion the U.S. government is going to spend this year is negligible. And there are no fiscal conservatives left in Washington, because anybody voted for all that COVID bailout nonsense, and they all did, has put us about $35 trillion in debt. So like the spending, that everybody votes on every year doesn't matter, because it's the mandatory spending. It's Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, interest on the national debt. All that stuff is going up like a hockey stick, right?
Yeah.
And so the $60 billion that we're talking about for Ukraine just doesn't matter. It doesn't move the needle at all. So what I don't understand is, can those guys not do math? So I don't know. One day we're going to look back at this conversation in this period of our lives, and we're all going to be ashamed.
Yeah, I do think that if this doesn't go the way it should, and Ukraine falls, it's going to be very, very sobering to allow Putin to have that win, because this is a guy who is he is the enemy. I mean, there's just no mistake about that, because of the support that he gives to Iran, the deal he has with China. I mean, that trifecta, and North Korea for that matter. Mm-hmm. I mean, so you got those four. Those are real threats to world peace, and we are literally handing him a win if we don't do something to bolster our efforts in Ukraine.
And to your point, we often fall into the trap, because we live in a social media driven world, that we're clicking on the next headline very quickly, and we look at these things in short sound bites and in isolation, but they're not. This is all connected. There's a big geopolitical struggle going on right now, which we're all a part of, whether we like it or not, right?
We are definitely a part of it, whether we like it or not, because we live in a world and this affects every aspect, not just from peace, but also free trade and the ability to have, economic growth. This is impacting every part of our life. Yep. And unfortunately, it's going to be really bad if we don't do something to help Ukraine.
Now, I'm conscious that I'm here in place of Chris today, and we're talking some very heavy stuff, and it's getting a little depressing. So I want to give Steve the opportunity to tell us some potentially uplifting moments of like where we can see opportunity. And if I kind of lead us into that with some of the polling numbers that we've seen, like we know that public opinion is strained. We know that particularly in this election year, people are talking about the southern border here in the US, inflation in the economy. It's having an impact on the idea that Americans, and particularly young Americans, are willing to support overseas activity. However, some of the polling that we've seen, and Steve, you and I have been analyzing polling data for about 18 years now. Sorry to age us both about how long we've been doing this, but with Congressman Peter Roskin back in 2008, that's when he and I started analyzing polling data.
Wheaton,
together.
Illinois.
Yeah.
Wheaton, Illinois.
In Wheaton, where I met my wife. I'll have to point
Exactly.
that out. So politics has been good for me.
That's right.
But the polling numbers are still, they're declining. They're softening, I guess, is a way to talk about it. But they're still positive. People still want to have an impact. They want to do some good. But I guess the question to you, Steve, and then maybe to you, Sean, as a follow-up is, we're political professionals. How do you manage that messaging to know that there has to be hope? There has to be positivity around this as well. It's a big question. Sorry.
How do you manage? I'm sorry, I was just looking at the lady behind me.
Sorry. She's joining the podcast.
Yeah, exactly. I just wanted to give her an opportunity to say something.
So I guess I'll frame it. We've seen some polling numbers. JL Partners is one of our polling partners. They also do polling for the Munich Security Conference. So they've got some experience in kind of polling around these policy issues. And they've talked about, sanctioning Russia was a net positive 49 in 2022. It's a net positive 44 now. Sending heavy weapons was a net positive 37 in 2022. It's still a net positive 16 now. So it seems like there's still support
for
these,
for sure.
But there's slippage. And so my question to you and Sean and myself, all of us as political operatives, is we message day in, day out. We understand what drives particular audiences. How do we message the Ukraine?
Let me tell you, okay, this is great. I'm glad you brought that up because there's like $250 billion in Russian assets that are under the control of European and Western countries. And there's a move afoot to, so those are frozen. And there's a move afoot to confiscate those and use those monies to pay for Ukraine's war and reconstruction. And so, I love this, for the people that like when Trump said, we'll build the wall and make Mexico pay for it. Well, how about we'll destroy Russia's military and let them pay for it?
Yeah, that's right.
And we can do that. This can happen. And so this is for real. So if people get creative rather than this sort of like weird negative anti-Ukraine stuff and Putin's not that bad of a guy, that's weird. But some of this stuff can happen. And let me tell you a couple, and I'll close out just on some fun things that people don't know, is that Ukraine's Navy is smaller than that of the almost landlocked desert country of Jordan.
Wow.
Yet they have destroyed 20% of Russia's Black Sea fleet and actually have made it ineffective. They have to actually now hide the fleet out of Ukraine's missile and drone range. The Ukrainians have developed homegrown nautical drones that take these ships out. They took out not only the Moskva, which was the flagship, they took out the replacement of the flagship, and they've taken out like a Kilo class submarine and like 25 other ships. So they've also really up the drone game. And, for whatever money we spend or will spend in Ukraine, it's worth it because our stuff doesn't work against, an adversary with a sophisticated electronic warfare capability. Okay. So our drones don't work here. You know whose drones work? Ukrainian drones. And so the Ukrainians have developed these drones, and now they're getting drones that can hit into Moscow and St. Petersburg. They've got these kamikaze drones that they're just, they don't have artillery shells, so they've developed homegrown kamikaze drones. Another thing that Americans don't know is that that Russia is now having trouble getting supplies from China because there's two main railroads, and they're in Siberia. And,
I read this. Yeah.
Yeah. Ukrainian special forces blew them both up.
That's
about 2,000 miles from Ukraine. So people say Ukraine can't win. Those people are not paying attention.
Yeah.
Well, and you made a point earlier, Steve. Sorry to jump in, Sean, about what the news was like a day or two after the invasion, and where we're at now. It's so different, and everybody wrote Ukraine off before 24 hours were over, and then Ukraine started. That was before a single dollar or cent was spent
Right.
sending American weapons there.
Right. Well, and I mean, I think what you raised, Steve, is really important about what the Ukrainians have been able to do, but also from the standpoint of being creative about how do we get through this. Let's get the funding there. Let's get this done. We can use these frozen assets as a part of continuing to win and then the rebuilding, but also as a part of the payback, because substantial amounts of this aid that's going to Ukraine is done under a Lend-Lease. Mm-hmm. So this is stuff that, just like we did with Great Britain in World War II,
yep.
There's going to be repayment of, if not all, a lot of what we've sent over.
Yep.
So, I mean, taking control of these Russian assets is, you said it was $750 billion. That's a lot of money.
Mm-hmm.
It's a lot of money.
Yep. And you only get repaid if you win. That's the other part of it.
That's a great point. I hadn't even thought about that point, but that's true.
Yeah. Steve, I know you've got a long journey ahead of you. Maybe we've got a couple more questions and then we can wrap up.
Stephen, I think that really whatever you want to close with, because you've been so generous with your time, and I know it's late there and you've got to get to, you have a long, long drive ahead of you.
Listen, I would love to hear from your listeners. They can go to ukrainefreedomproject.org. That's ukrainefreedomproject.org. We're a 501c3. If you like what we're doing over here, we've gotten about $1.2 million worth of aid to the front. Again, I'm talking to Congress. I'm telling them what's really going on over here. I've spoken to about 100 members of Congress. And so if you like that sort of thing, help us out. We could use a couple of bucks, gas money to get this back to Poland. Would appreciate that. Also, if you want to learn more about the horrible things that are happening to Ukrainian Protestants, if you want to see actual testimonies from Ukrainian pastors who've been tortured, if you want to see video footage of churches that have been wiped out in the occupied territories, go to RussiaTorturesChristians.org. That's RussiaTorturesChristians.org. Have a look there. Send it to your friends. Send it around. This is real, and we need your help.
Great. So thank you so much, Stephen. We appreciate the time, and safe travels, and stay safe while you're there helping save the world.
Absolutely. I think we can say we touched on faith, freedom, and free enterprise today.
That is for sure. Good
Love
point.
It. Love it.
Thanks again,
right.
Steve. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Steve.
Thanks, guys. We'd love to come back. We'd love to do it again soon.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
We'll see you.
All right. We'll talk to you. See you. Bye-bye.